Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will now start our conference, and please join me in welcoming Professor James Reardon-Anderson, Interim Dean of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you especially to Chevron Corporation for funding the second of our conferences on former Soviet areas. We met last fall on Ukraine, and we're back here again today to look at the stands, Central Asia. We're particularly interested in this topic because of all of the regions of the world, one would have to say that Central Asia ranks very high in the difference between the intrinsic importance of the region and the attention it gets, certainly in American higher education. And therefore I salute Angela and the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies in highlighting Central Asia in our conference schedule for this year. I thank you all very much for coming. I wish I could stay with you for the day because I'm frankly, personally very interested in Central Asia. I'm a China scholar, and I'm acutely aware of the growing importance of this region, not only for the West, but also for the East. I'm going to have to look at it on videotape. Angela promises me that the center will get it up on video after today's proceedings. But anyway, thank you very much. Welcome to Georgetown, and I wish you the best for today. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, and I'd like to add my welcome to all of you for coming today to the conference to talk about, I guess, both the choices and the challenges that Central Asia faces going forward. I would also like to thank Chevron for its support of the conference, and I would like to also thank the CERES team that organized, that made this possible, Dr. Benjamin Loring, our Associate Director, Lauren Manzur, who is our events organizer, and Christina Watts, who also helped organize this. So a great thank you to them. And I would now like to call Roger Kangas. Would you like to come up to the podium? So it's a great pleasure to begin with our keynote speaker, Professor Roger Kangas. He is, of course, a son of Georgetown, a graduate of the School of Foreign Service, and has been teaching here courses on Central Asia for some time. He is the academic dean of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, which is at the National Defense University here in Washington. And during the past 25 years, he specialized in political and security issues relating to Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the surrounding region. He has previously worked in the George C. Marshall Center for European Security in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. He worked at the Johns Hopkins SAIS in the Central Asia Institute, at the Open Media Research Institute in the Czech Republic, and in the Department of Political Science at the University of Mississippi. As I said, he has his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and his PhD in political science from Indiana, and he is really going to set the stage for us today and provide a sort of broad overview of the issues in Central Asia. So welcome, Roger.
Thank you, Angela, and good morning, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, and to kick this off, I should say, when I look at the agenda, it really is a wonderful listing of who's who in the DC area and in academia that focuses on Central Asia, and so I look forward to the comments said today. I should say also, on a personal note, I was hoping that my son would attend this conference. He's a sophomore here, so there's a new one, and his dorm is actually feet from this room. I'm not going to go any farther, but sadly he has a class right now, because I actually talked to him this morning, and I said, "So you going to stop by and see your old man?" And he says, "No, I have class." He has, of course, East European history. Yes, he's not going too far. And it's interesting because it's a course that I took here in the last century by the same professor. So he is actually taking the same guy I did. I can't give him my notes because, of course, it's a different time. It was a different era. And that, I start with this because the sort of discussion that that class is having right now has to be quite different from the one that I had during the Cold War. If you think about Eastern Europe, its future trajectory, what were the possibilities, the dynamics for these countries? It all must seem pretty antiquated and simple today compared to the current realities. So imagine that same sort of discussion about Central Asia. In the early 1980s, we weren't thinking about independence, security dynamics, agency. We were really looking at this as a part of a broader picture in a bilateral existential conflict. This has changed, and it continues to change. And I think what makes it challenging for us when we look at Central Asia is, quite frankly, to see that as we go year on year, and especially those of us who've been looking at it for some time, the things that we give as sort of assumptions or as givens constantly change themselves. My task is pretty simple here. As I said, I'm just simply going to highlight a few key points and say, well, the areas of domestic politics and energy and security, here might be some things we could look at, and we'll let the experts throughout the day really hone in on these. But what I'd like to do is sort of take a step back and think in a broader framework. Why is this important, and what might be some of the bigger challenges? And to that, of course, I'm going to have to go back to the great 20th century philosopher and writer Clint Eastwood and Sergio Leone in their famous The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, 1966, great vintage film. And it's a movie about greed, hidden treasures, and shifting alliances that emerge so one can come out a winner. It kind of sounds like Central Asia, or at least how we envision it, how we look at Central Asia in this zero-sum setting where we try to figure out who's on top, who's gaining what, who is losing. These are the challenges we have. Now, that's kind of where I'll stop the comparison. Don't worry, I'm not going to make this long analogy comparing it to a Hollywood movie, even though I would suggest the Calabrian set, which is supposed to double for the American Southwest, does look a lot like Uzbekistan, but that's just a visual. I'll want to point to some of the key issues at play. Now, first is the good, the reason for optimism. And one of these is actually a point we'll look at later today, which is energy exporting and the potential for further energy exports. Now, I'll use the word potential, and I will underscore this because even though it's been several decades since we've talked about the next Persian Gulf, we're looking in terms of the future. Well, for some countries, the future is now. Kazakhstan has benefited greatly from energy exports. Turkmenistan is beginning to at least believe that it is benefiting from energy exports, even though perhaps this bilateral tie it had with Russia has now been replaced by one with China. We are looking at countries exporting far more energy than we had anticipated decades ago. We are hopeful that hydropower and the famous CASA 1000, and I even heard it rephrased CASA 1300, it's going to get bigger and better, I think, with age, that these projects are going to be the panacea, the lifesaver for the mountainous states of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and also provide energy 24/7 for surrounding nations. An ambitious goal, but again, it's one that we support, the United States government. It's also one, I would argue, that states in the region support, but on certain competing conditions, and this is the challenge we have here. And so, on one hand, great, here's a positive thing to look at. A second positive element, an odd one to say perhaps, but is education. Now, I know those who study education, and this actually has been a focal point of analysis in the post-Soviet space, we can say that on a number of levels, the education system is in crisis. It's an infrastructure and a software infrastructure, so to speak, that really hasn't developed over the last 20 years, if we think in terms of primary education, where money is constantly lacking and where teachers are concerned of the quality of education that they're having to work with in country. That's part of the picture, but there has been progress. There has been progress largely at the upper end. And I know that this is if you want to say, a split view, but you do now have a good range of students who've studied abroad, who've studied different languages than the usual local language and Russian, The opportunity to connect with the outside world in many ways for students is greater now in Central Asia than ever before. But there's a sort of a qualification on that. That is, sometimes that can be detrimental. Sometimes they can be called back at a moment's notice, depending on a political crisis. And of course, the concern of loyalty to the state may come up if they study in a country that suddenly is not quite an ally to their state. And so these are issues that all of us in education have to worry about, but I would say we see this in Central Asia. Why do I put this as a positive? Because these very individuals who go overseas, they do pick up the ideas, they do pick up the values, they do understand at least the values expressed outside. And it's curious to see how this evolution changes over time in country. And the third good, so to speak, I would say, is existential reality. That is, we don't have to talk about, are these states surviving? Are these states really real states, which is what we did discuss 20 years ago? But rather, these are states. These are states, warts and all. They have their faults, they have their problems, they have their benefits, they have their advantages. They're states that also have choice. And this is becoming an interesting phenomena for the rest of us to think about, and I'll get back to this a bit later. But what we're looking at today are a collection of 5 specific countries that you almost hate to sort of group together as one collective Central Asia that stands, because they are looking in different directions. And they're looking in different directions and starting to make choices. Which paths do we take? Which alliances do we secure? Who do we distance ourselves from, and why? We're starting to see the existential decisions, so to speak, being made in country, not somewhere else, not in Moscow, not in Washington, not elsewhere. Yes, not in Moscow, believe it or not, I think that. So these are some positive aspects. Well, what about the bad, the reasons for pessimism? And I can quickly note these to say, first is information access. Now right away I said, wait a second, you just said education, they're exposed to all these ideas. You're right, leaving the country, they can be exposed to a wide range of ideas. Coming back home, they may find these opportunities are limited. Of course, I see this in other states as well. I do some work in the United Arab Emirates, in Turkey, and other countries, and I find that educational opportunities and sources are also limited online and in real life in libraries. But we're starting to see, of course, that information and the control of information is definitely seen as a priority. It also suggests that when we look at media coverage, what is said in the region isn't what we in the West, and I would say in the US in particular, would understand as the, so to speak, day-to-day truth. Just on a couple of quick anecdotes, during the 2008 Georgian-Russian conflict, I was in Dushanbe. And it was interesting because I was getting the Russian coverage of it. And thank God those South Ossetians were saved from genocide. And that those who wanted to foil the efforts and the evil Georgians, parenthetically stated Nazis, didn't get their way. Now, of course, when one leaves that environment and comes back and you hear the rest of the story, you realize, wait a second, I didn't quite hear the full truth on this. I didn't quite hear what was really said, what really happened. And even as complex as we want to say that that particular event was, of course we know that there are other stories at play. The same thing happened in 2010 in Walsh in Jalalabad and other events. The media coverage and the way events are analyzed are quite different than what we know and anticipate, and no surprise it causes a great distancing, east and west. And I would add, one final element on this. It creates a wonderful platform and environment for conspiracy theories. In fact, it was just at my table earlier and just telling a recent conspiracy theory that I picked up, which suggested that the development and rise of IS, or the Islamic State, or Daesh, or whatever we want to call it, is actually a US, parentheses, CIA, engineered plot to target the Russian soft underbelly. Now, it's of course best exemplified by a map that I was able to pick up on this from a site that showed that if you actually combined the unrest in Nigeria, Boko Haram, the Trans-Sahel region, Libya, Yemen. Of course, it all kind of leads into this wonderful direction towards Syria and Iraq. And then if you simply continue the trajectory, it lends itself right into southern Russia. So naturally, this is all a plot to destabilize Russia, and it's a plot to destabilize Russia's allies. And this is a concern, because when you start to read this and hear this, you may sort of smile and giggle and say, well, that's kind of cute, but who would believe it? Trust me, people do. In fact, I spent this past week with a group of people who truly believe these sorts of theories. Again, information access is a point that I really take to heart. Second bad element is the infrastructural environment. Now, when I said that, education has had its challenges in terms of funding, so have roads and bridges and ports and the basic infrastructure system that we see in any city, in any state. In some instances, we are still looking at Soviet-era products. Now, I say this with some caution, having to go up I-95 every day and understand that the infrastructure development in my own country sometimes is at a pretty basic rate. If anyone's not hit a pothole on the 14th Street Bridge, please raise your hand. But having said that, it's clear that if we want to build a modern Silk Road, a new Silk Road, or whatever Silk Road we call it, real infrastructural development has to take place. It can't just be planned, it has to actually happen. Now, there are companies and there are governments that are interested in this, but this is going to take a multi-billion-dollar effort to truly modernize the infrastructure, and so it can compete and equate with the neighboring states. And finally, the last bad point, so to speak, it's about politics. Throw this one out. The political environment has increasingly changed, and I don't think we outsiders have quite kept up in understanding it. Now, some, in fact, at my table, a couple of people definitely have, and I look forward to hearing them this morning. But I will say that when we look at the leadership structures, power dynamics, we see a shift taking place from, obviously, if, we still want to say an older Soviet-era model to something else. Now, for 20 years, we tried, many efforts to democratize, to create political party systems, open medias, et cetera, et cetera. I confess I was part of a number of these efforts as well. They almost all failed. They almost all failed. And the question is why? Did they fail because we moved too quickly? Did they fail because we didn't listen? Did they fail because there were attractive alternatives? And in many ways, each of these is part of the truth. There's also, I think, part of this failure and part of this inability to change the political systems, a hubris that developed on our side after the Cold War. Whether we called it the unipolar moment or the end of history, we felt that, yeah, we'll help them as a victor would help the vanquished. We made comparisons to Germany and Japan at the end of World War II. And in fact, we treated this as a victory worthy of the most obnoxious end zone victory dance or celebration. And from our side, that made sense. From the other side, and not just the Russian perspective, but the Central Asian, the Ukrainian, the Moldovan, and anyone else, it was insulting. And we didn't quite get it. And so no surprise when we tried to impose, and I'll use that word, a particular view on politics, party formation, etc., we met with resistance and ultimately with results probably not to our liking. And what hurts even more is the sense that today, when you look at the term democracy, it usually equates with chaos. And when you look at the term free market, it usually equates with the term kleptocracy. This is not what we intended. But obviously, this is something that has happened in the region and something that needs to change. So, a couple of pessimistic comments. To close then, what are some worst-case scenarios or best-case scenarios or things to look at in the future if we want to say, what's the ugly? What are some of the things that we want to sort of sink our teeth in and really talk about, which we can do this morning and really, quite frankly, as the day goes on? Well, first is going to be about politics again. It's about succession. It's about leadership transition. Now, the usual worry here is, a leader eventually passes on and there'll be chaos, confusion, civil war will break out. And we see these things happen in other parts of the world. We also see in other parts of the world, and we've already seen in Central Asia, a leader passes on, the other leaders get together, make a decision, and a legitimacy is somehow inferred upon this new individual. It's a papal model of succession for sure, but it works. Is it democratic? Not necessarily. Does it create stability? In the short run, yes. In the long term, let's wait and see. But we have to imagine, of course, that succession and that leadership transitions inevitably have to take place. Actuary tables don't lie. People do pass on. And we will have to think in terms of how can these transitions take place. We don't have a large N. We have, 3 coups, if we want to call it that. We have 1 death in office and 1 electoral transition. Not a lot to work on in over 20 years. But one expects that these are things that are going to come up in the coming years. Second issue that is going to come up that we need to pay attention to, the infiltration of radical ideas. Now, I mentioned the sort of conspiracy theories about Daesh or IS. We can get more sinister. I actually do think that this is a concern in the region. Now, we can look at all the statistics on the number of Central Asians and Russians and those from the Caucasus, et cetera, who are migrating to the Islamic State and fighting the good fight. And yes, there are more from Western Europe and other countries going, no question. And yes, finally, we can say that most of these are actually coming not directly from the region, but as guest workers in Russia, unable to find employment. And quite frankly, it's incredibly easy to get a flight from Moscow to Istanbul. And then once you get to Istanbul, you can vanish. And you can cross the border. It's quite open. So why is this a concern? Because in the past, when we had extremist groups and threats, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Adolat, among others, they were very specific. They, in fact, were very simple in their approaches. Their multimedia campaign was primitive. Their recruitment policies were amateurish to okay, and ultimately they didn't meet with much success. And not even just that they were defeated on the battlefield at times or apprehended after attacks, but that they didn't really gain much popular support. This new effort is something different, and it taps into a frustration and an angst that we find among different communities and constituencies, and not just in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. We find it in North Dakota and Manchester and other places as well. We find this concern of, hey, I'm going to gravitate to this new group, and I would encourage anyone to take a quick peek at some of these sites, not on your government computer if you're a government employee, but do it on your personal one, or better yet, on somebody else's, so they can pick up the virus. And you'll find that it's actually quite sophisticated. It's quite appealing, actually. And you could see, for somebody who was really distraught and concerned, this is an avenue. Now, the immediate reaction to this is, oh, you're overblowing it, because, of course, it's now the thing that's on 24/7 on CNN and all the news channels, right? Well, yes and no. Perhaps we are exaggerating this threat, but let's be blunt. A year ago, we didn't really even talk about its existence. 2 years ago, for sure. And so we're still in that process of understanding what this new entity is. And when you have individuals in Afghanistan, when you have Taliban groups actually swearing allegiance, this is an interesting challenge. The final, what to look for in the future. And this is this is an issue that I hope we address in the final panel on security, is I still worry, I do worry a lot, but I still worry that we remain in the state where we're instrumentalizing Central Asia. Outsiders in particular, but even in the region, we still tend to think of things in terms of bargains that can be hammered out for specific end states and then dispensed with when that end state is over. Of course, the classic example, which will be written on, I think, for years to come, is the security relationship the U.S. had with several Central Asian states from 2001 to 2014. We looked at the region through the lens of Afghanistan, and we looked at the region through the lens of helping us achieve a security objective in Afghanistan. we didn't really care about Central Asia in and of itself. Now, some individuals did, and I'm really proud to know these people, but quite frankly, a number of folks simply said, hey, we have to check some blocks, we need to take care of things in Afghanistan, and now that that dynamic is over, and I should say over, yes, Resolute Support Mission is there, yes, there are U.S. troops there, but this transit route through Central Asia is not required. It's making us rethink the region. For example, the Manas Transit Center closed last year, as bases close worldwide. Does this mean that Kyrgyzstan is less important to the U.S. than it was, say, a year or two ago? Absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of our policy and in terms of our security interest, Kyrgyzstan has really dropped quite low. And in fact, some could suggest or argue that we may even have a punitive policy. Kyrgyzstan wants to shut our base down? Great. Let's cut off ties with them, or let's reduce aid to them to let them know that we mean business, and that wasn't a good thing to do. It's just a suggestion. Could we improve ties with other states? Absolutely. But to what end? And this now becomes a challenge in the region, and I would say in the U.S. government, but also in European governments, is as we look at this region, are we continuing to think of it in terms of how is it affecting something else? How are we using it to block out Russia? Are we using it to block out China? Or if I'm in Moscow, am I forging ties in Central Asia to block out the U.S., to prevent other countries from engaging in the region? It's one thing to look at national interests. It's another thing to play at this like a fifth grade playground. And unfortunately, I still think that when we look at Central Asia, we have that latter quality. Now, the challenge, I would say, for us in particular, and here I'll kind of put on the U.S. hat for just a moment, is what is our policy and what is our interest towards Central Asia? We've gone through different stages. We've gone through the post-Soviet, let's create independent states, let's support them, let's democratize, let's create free market economies, let's focus on human rights. We've looked at energy, let's diversify the energy routes. We've looked at security. It's 2015. What next? Do we simply rehash old ideas and reprioritize them? Or do we look at new ideas, new approaches? Or do we even rethink our role in this region? Which is a hard thing to do, to say maybe we are not first among equals or even just among equals, but maybe we're simply an accessible partner that can play a key role when needed. This is a challenge for our folks at State Department, and I'm really happy that Dick Hoagland is speaking here at lunch, who can enlighten us further on these issues, and I know that this is a topic that we'll look at later today. Well, I've sort of said, like I said, kind of the list of thoughts, and you can jot them all down. There are 3 threes if you want to think in terms of Chinese philosophy. But what does all this mean? Well, first of all, each of these topics is worthy of further discussion. And there are a host of other topics that could be raised. Yes, I didn't touch on a number of things, and perhaps we can raise some of these right now. But I hope that they've been able to spark a little interest in thinking about our region. I should also stress that the current trajectories are not set in stone, and I refuse to believe in some sort of inevitable fate. Looking at other nations around the world, over the past quarter century, it's clear that changes can happen, and sometimes in rather radical and unexpected ways. Whether it's a Myanmar suddenly opening up-ish, whether it is a Yemen suddenly collapsing, well, for the 4th time this decade. But states can go through changes, and we have to adjust to these. And again, in unexpected ways. And so when we say Central Asia, what next? The topic of this conference, well, that quite frankly is an incredibly interesting question. And I look forward to having us examine this as the day goes on. I thank you for your time and your attention. Okay.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was a brilliant tour d'horizon. I'm going to ask you the first question, and then we will open it up. So I want to come to the ugly part 1.
Okay.
Which has to do with succession, but more probably broadly with domestic politics. You talked about really the failure of U.S. policy in the region to sort of promote the kinds of political and economic developments that we wanted to. How much influence do you think the two other major, I guess, outside players, Russia and China, have on domestic developments in this region?
No, that's an excellent question. And I should note, because as I was going through this, in my mind I'm thinking, I actually am an optimist. It doesn't show. I'm a Cubs fan, so yay. But I really was coming across as a Debbie Downer. So I thinking, well, gee, how can I now get back to optimism? I can't. So I'll get to the point about the other factors. I do think there are influences, less so Russia, more so China. China has a very interesting engagement program, and it's not just sort of this broader Go West effort, and a number of folks actually in this room have written on that, but it's also an interesting template or model of non-interference in the domestic affairs of neighboring states, first and foremost. That's a wonderful policy. When they conduct security cooperation with the state, it's almost in contrast to how we do it. We will say, hey, we want to conduct a program with you, whether it's in security or education or economics, you name it. But first, here are 17 preconditions we want to discuss, and here's a number of factors that we really want to make clear you need to worry about or think about or sign off on. We front load our problems. The Chinese, quite frankly, don't do that. It's very much a, hey, we want to cooperate, wonderful, here's a check. But I call it the Don Corleone school of bargaining, which is, a day may come where I may need your assistance, and when that day comes, I will come to your door. And I do worry, and Turkmenistan's a good example, where they've signed off on some interesting gas deals. Somewhere down the road, there's going to be a payback that, unfortunately, the Turkmen may not like, but they are going to be obligated to fulfill. And so, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, in the short run, they do provide an interesting model. And I would also say there's it's a challenge that when we, the West, and again, I'm rather critical of the West in doing this, but when we were looking at these reform policies, and I remember working on some campaign efforts in both Russia and in Central Asia, where it's actually, let's teach candidates how to campaign for office. And to think that we would actually impose, 1992 or 94 U.S. onto a completely alien system was a bit much, and there probably should have been, in retrospect, an understanding of the local culture and dynamics. Quite frankly, what we did in countries like Japan, which had a democratic tradition, but also had a very sort of pronounced, distinct culture, and that's a post-World War II victor-vanquished relationship. We actually, I think, had greater respect for Japanese culture and traditions than we did sometimes in the post-Soviet space. And so that caused problems, yeah.
Okay. Do you want to field your
Sure.
own questions?
Sir. Or...
Thank you. Jeff Goldstein from the Open Society Foundations. Roger, I just wanted to throw one more thing onto your list. The director of our foundation from Dushanbe was here right after the elections. And interestingly, they didn't want to talk about the elections. All they wanted to talk about was the economic situation, in particular, the impact of what's going on in Russia. I mean, they're looking at a country with 57% of GDP from remittances. Mm-hmm. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan not far behind. Precipitous fall already, but even more scary for them, they're beginning to see people come back from Russia, which didn't even happen in 2008. And I think this is important also because it brings up your question of the instrumentalization of Central Asia, because I'm sure no one thought about this when the policy of sanctioning Russia was put out, and yet listening to the Russian TV, as you were doing, and people are in this region, they're hearing that all of this is because of the United States. So, comment rather than a question. Thanks.
Okay. No, and actually it's one, just as a kind of a quick follow-up on that, that dynamic of the, and the concern of the economic collapse, and particularly, the country you mentioned, but even in some of the neighboring ones, are similar things that I hear. And the blame is placed squarely on, and it's even a case of the U.S. more so than the Europeans. The narrative is the Europeans want to lift the sanctions, the Americans don't. And it almost becomes a let's further target the U.S., which is, you're right, problematic.
Hi, good morning. I'm Navbahari Mamova from the Voice of America. Roger, can you think of any options that you think that U.S. has that it hasn't tried? Because any U.S. official would tell you, we've done that, we've tested that, that approach didn't work. And they may also tell you that, frankly, we have not been overloading countries of Central Asia with a lot of conditions lately. So anything that you could suggest that they could try?
Okay. Actually, yes, sort of a simple approach, which is don't, how should I say, we're trying too hard. We're like a really bad first date that's gone on for 20-some years. And we want them to love us. We're kind of the Sally Fields, right, of the world, And and that gets to be overkill. And actually, on a serious note on this, because we come across now, and this is no shock. I mean, public opinion after public opinion, and often Western engineered public opinions. This is not sort of local twists on things, if we want to say, even worry about that. Note that the perception issues of our policies vis-a-vis the region is negative. We're seen as boorish, as bullying. I would even say in our embassies, and this is a challenge I know that a lot of our embassy officials have, they're not able to really even go out and meet people, talk to people. They're busy sort of working in their isolated zone of the embassy compound. The expat community is equally isolated. Much less than it was in the past. I know there are security concerns and security issues, and quite frankly, a lot of busy days, but what we fail to do is really have a better understanding of the situation on the ground and an understanding of what are perhaps those 2 or 3 things that we can work on, and really leave it at that. And it's not to say vanish. I'm not suggesting withdrawal from the region, to hell with it, we don't need it. I mean, for a lot of us in the room, we devote our lives to this, to better understanding U.S. Central Asian ties or interest in the region, but I think it has to be done on a more limited basis, and at least start going back to that adage of start for the areas where you can get decent cooperation between the partners, and yes, you have to deal with the hard issues as well. You can't just ignore them, but this also entails an investment. It entails an investment in time and people. And usually at some point I have to make a plug, but this is one where I always feel committed to doing this. We have to invest in education on our side. We have to invest in the people who study the region. We have to invest in the future people who will study the region, so we can have a better handle on what's going on. Now, the curious thing is we actually have a good cadre in the U.S. of people who know more than just Central Asia, post-Soviet space, and think in terms of that. A very nuanced, refined, and I would say intellectually creative approach to the region. We need to hear these voices. And so there's a lot of, I think, ways where we can do this that are at low cost. I deal with budgets every day, and I'm constantly thinking, okay, how much can we do it for less? Well, we can do it for less. We don't have to go in with huge, expansive programs. It can often just be, we're present, we can listen, we can be partners. The people who are going to come in with the massive engagement programs are already there. China's going to outspend us no matter how we try to combat that. Russia, we'll see how much they can spend, but most definitely through the Eurasian Economic Union, we're going to see a relationship that's going to become very interesting and I think very tight in the coming years. And so we simply need to be an opportunity there, not necessarily one that's driving a specific agenda. Other thoughts? Oh, come on, it's morning.
Okay. That's right. People haven't had enough coffee.
Okay, yes.
Any skinny on the election results in Uzbekistan?
Hey, what?
Any skinny on the election results in Uzbekistan?
Oh, I actually, say it again.
Have you heard anything about the election results in Uzbekistan?
Election results. Actually, I have not, simply because I was out of the country till the other day, and so I am behind. So I could give you a fabricated answer, but I'm going to actually have to say I haven't heard really anything insightful or new other than what's been sort of published in your basic media.
Well, maybe to add to that, so if, as we are to believe, that President Karimov, let's say, gets, say, 90% of the vote, or maybe more, what does that tell us going forward? It's just more of the same in Uzbekistan? I mean, what was the, what's the impact of this?
My concern, and this is where I'll get sort of more an opinion element of that, my concern is that we're defaulting to no other alternative, that the effort to seriously look at alternatives isn't being explored right now and is being pushed back to the latest possible moment. Now, I will make one other confession, of course, as a Chicagoan. I grew up during the era of Richard J. Daley. And in terms of Chicago mayordoms, this was a regime that looks scarily familiar. And it was one, quite frankly, when it was over, it was over. That is, when he passed on, there was a quick scramble for successors, and it was a pretty weak field, that no successor really had been groomed. Now, this is, of course, in a nice, simple, safe urban setting in the U.S. When we look at national settings in areas that are rather contentious or problematic, it does raise concerns for all of the countries in the region. Not that there has to be the same 24/7, presidential media coverage that we see here in the U.S., right, where almost everything is cast in terms of 2016 candidates, and we're going to get this for the next 18 months or so. But there ought to be some thought given to options. There ought to be some thought given to open debate and discussion about what's next. And I know because you have systems where you have a fairly strong leader, people are reluctant to do that. And people are also reluctant to stick their neck out to be that person, to be that alternative, because, of course, there could be repercussions. One can go back to their old editions of Merle Feinsod, and you realize that the dynamics in many ways haven't progressed beyond what folks were familiar with years back. And so that does worry me. That there is a popularity, that there is an election and it takes place, and that we have a continuation of the regime, got it. That happens worldwide. But my worry is, well, after this, are we really preparing for something else? Or are we going to have this, death in office, and then a kind of a caucus of key leaders, and then somebody else put up that the population is going to grudgingly have to accept? And that, I hope, is not the course of action. Yeah.
Any other
One more, and then.
comments? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Fries. I'm a CERES MA candidate this year, and also with the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. But I guess I'm asking under my student hat. Wondering, speaking of the EU, what you think the implications of that are for interregional dynamics and relations moving forwards as new countries are deciding whether or not to join and others are staunchly not going to. Thank you.
Okay. No, this is actually, and in fact, in speaking with Russian colleagues and Russian friends about this, it's fascinating because I get you're overblowing the importance of the EEU. It's not what you think. It's not going to be this controlling, manipulating structure that will have Russia dominating its neighboring states. And yet everything suggests that that's a path that at least certain people in Moscow would like it to go. I think the EEU, first of all, we are going to have an expansion in Central Asia, and we are going to see Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan as members. Kazakhstan already is. In Kazakhstan, there's a healthy debate of whether it's actually beneficial or not. Will it open up certain markets? You know very well the challenges it provides now for Kazakh businesses and Kazakh firms. So we're going to see this work itself out. I mean, you have a disproportionate percentage of the economy, obviously, in one state, in this rather, I would say, structured economic union. It's not like the European Union, where you have it fairly diffused, or at least where there are a couple of poles of major players, of France, Italy, Germany, if you think of the early European economic community. So we're already stuck with a lopsided structure that I would argue is going to be detrimental to the junior partners in that arrangement, unless they can have certain opt-outs or certain opportunities to trade outside. And this gets to your point about regional trade. The other two countries, I'm highly doubtful, will become members. Uzbekistan, quite frankly, is taking a course of action that I find is logical. They can trade with these partners, but to become part of the EEU would curtail Uzbek economic sovereignty, which is something that they hold rather dear. Turkmenistan technically could be part of it, even though it's positive, has a positive neutrality policy. This is not a security structure, but they're not going to join. And they're busy looking southward and in other directions. And so I actually see in some ways, unfortunately, a process where we could look at 3 states quasi-integrated in a Russian-dominated matrix, and the other 2 states starting to look in other directions, and intra-regional, intra-Central Asian trade actually being stymied. Yes, we could see some trade routes, and you would see the major border posts or the major crossing points, the Uzbek-Kazakh border, being one. But you're going to see Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, I think, looking elsewhere, rightfully so, and finding opportunities elsewhere. If we have an Iran sanctions deal somehow struck in the next hours, day, in the next 28 hours or so, maybe we could see even opening up in that direction, southward to Afghanistan, Pakistan, you name it. I mean, India's making inroads into the region and would definitely like to trade, and you would start to see 2 different tracks. And so I actually see it as sort of a quasi-split. Now, having said that, in Europe, you don't really see the presence of the EU being so detrimental to the non-EU states. But that's also, it's a multi-state, diversified structure where there are opportunities for all present. So, in some ways it would be great if that would be the solution in Central Asia. That may be a bit too far. So, some general thoughts.
Great. Please join me in thanking Professor Kangas for a great.
Thank you very much.